Hey guys, welcome to today's video. You are going to see how I build a simple but elegant planter box for a raised garden bed for our backyard. Now, this is a pretty basic project to do. It's going to use most of the tools that you're going to see here. It goes pretty quick. I mean, I'll be honest, me being a dad, I'm not able to always knock it out in one go. So you'll see me do this over the course of a couple of days. But in the end, very enjoyable project. If you've never worked with cedar before, it's great. It's pretty soft wood. You can cut it pretty quickly and easily. Also, smells great, so don't judge me, okay? If you've worked with cedar before, you know exactly what I'm talking about. If not, you should work with some cedar. Try the project today. Let me know what you think, but come along for today's video and look forward to showing you how we get this done. Let's get to it. Now, for these planters, you could do as complex of a shape as you want to, but I'm a simple guy, so I'm just doing two massive rectangles. Now, the long end is going to be 8 feet, while the short end is just under 4 feet at 46 inches. And then the depth of the box will be 14.5 inches. The reason why it's 14.5 inches, and that's oddly specific, is because the cedar 1x8 plank that I'm using is actually not 8 inches wide. It's 7.25 inch wide. So two of those stacked together is going to give me that 14.5 inch measurement. Now, the cut sheet that I'm writing out here for you actually is going to be just for a single planter box. So you can feel free to double, triple, or just make a single cedar planter if you'd like to. For any exterior projects that involve wood, just like these planter boxes, I would definitely recommend that you use a rot resistant wood. So I am using cedar 1x8s and cedar 2x4s for this whole project. Now, if you've looked at prices of cedar in the store recently, you may say, Kevin, I am not made of money. I cannot afford cedar. And truth is, I can't either. I'm just using some extra material that I've left over from a previous project. Now, you'll see in a minute where that cut list really comes in handy because, again, although I'm just making two rectangles, it's really nice to know, hey, I need this many pieces in this size, this many pieces in that size. And although you can pre-mark it with a speed square and a tape measure like I've done, something that would be really helpful to do is actually use a stop block. That is something that I'm in the process of adding to my own wood shop here in my garage just to make things go a little bit quicker on additional projects. To hold all these pieces together, I am going to use some exterior decking screws, but I don't want those screws to be exposed. So I'm going to bookend 2 of the 2x4s on each corner with a 45-degree miter to, again, hide those screws, but it kind of makes the planter look a little bit nicer. Now, it's an appropriate level of niceness, okay? You don't want to get too fancy with your vegetable garden, but this, I feel, it's the appropriate level of fancy. I went ahead and used that 14.5-inch measurement for the depth of the box to make 16 of these end pieces. Now, the 16 pieces will be paired together to make 8 mitered corners for the 2 planters. And to set up that 45-degree angle, I just used my table saw, shifted it all the way over to a 45, and then before I actually started my final cut, I used just a test piece here and slowly slid over that rail on my table saw to allow me to make a few test cuts and just figure out exactly where I wanted that 45 to hit. This method that I used to just eyeball where the fence was and eyeball where the saw would hit the 45 was pretty effective, but if you have a better suggestion about how to get cuts like this dialed in more quickly, please let me know in the comments below. Now, after I set all that up, I went ahead and actually did my first pass for cutting these corners. Now, I will say this, you'll probably notice that the way I'm cutting these is pretty janky because I'm using that finger on one end and then I'm using a push stick on the other. I actually ended up breaking the throat plate on my table saw, so I would highly recommend that if you break the throat plate covering the blade on your table saw, that you would go ahead and just redeem the warranty instead of waiting weeks and months like I did. Now, the next step of this project was to create 8 interior corner pieces that I would use to mount the cedar 1x8 to. Now, I just used the 14.5-inch measurement again, and if you've noticed anything about my drawings, they definitely are not to scale, but as long as you follow the measurements, I think you'll be okay. So I did use some cedar 2x6s and just rip them down using my table saw. Okay, so I'll correct myself. Previously in the video I talked about, I have only used 2x4s and 1x8s. I actually used a 2x6 here, but again, I used the table saw and I ripped it down to be 1 3/4 inch wide, and I'm actually going to make that 1 3/4 inch square. So I would just flip it on the straight edge that I just cut, use that straight edge up against my fence, and then cut down the other side. Now you can see I'm just using my job site table saw to rip all these down. I didn't have an outfeed table, so it did make some of these cuts a little bit more difficult and scarier than I would have liked them to be. But as long as you go slow and steady, you will win the proverbial race, as they like to say. Or I guess the race in this case is the fact that you get to keep your fingers. So definitely be careful, go slow, take your time to make the right cuts. Now for the fun part, which is putting it all together. So I'm using a T25 star bit with an impact driver, just a normal drill with an 1/8 inch drill bit, which you'll see here in just a moment. I am using 1 1/4 inch exterior decking screws, and using that drill bit is going to allow me to drill some pilot holes, so I'm not going to split that cedar. I also use a little bit larger drill bit to kind of make a hybrid countersink bit, which you'll see here in a minute. If you do have a countersink bit, go ahead and use that, but at the time I actually didn't own one. So I use this larger one instead. Now you're never going to see these screws, but I still wanted them to be uniform. So all I did was just took my speed square and marked an inch off of that edge of that board. And then every 1.5 inches, I just drilled a hole. Now you'll notice when I use that larger drill bit, I am being pretty delicate and just barely spinning the impact driver on top of that hole to create a little countersink hole. This just takes a little bit of practice. And really, I was actually surprised how well this worked. I didn't have to go back and set anything back up or actually re-drill any holes. So I would definitely recommend this if you don't want to spend about 50 bucks on a countersink bit. After that, I took all the pieces to my back patio to begin the assembly process for this. Now, I tried to adopt an assembly line style here. So, hey, Henry Ford is at least good for one thing, right? The assembly line. And I guess maybe trucks or cars. But who cares about that, because we're talking about a cedar planter. Now, this assembly line style was one of the reasons I did these pre-drilled holes. So the pre-drilled holes allowed me to just, on each individual end panel, rather than trying to hold everything together and insert a screw at one time, it would allow me to take the screw, lightly tighten each screw in each hole by hand, and then come back with the impact driver and drive everything home. Using this assembly line process, it did make things quicker and more efficient, which is great, but it also freed me up to focus on the most important part of assembling these planters. Now, maybe you're telling yourself, look, all you're doing is you're just building 2 boxes. That's not too complicated. And you would be right. It really isn't too complicated as long as you do the first step correct, which is the very bottom plank that touches that interior piece. You got to make sure that it's squared, because if it's messed up, then the piece you put on top is going to be out of square, and then your whole panel is going to be wonky, and then your other panel is going to be wonky. So really focusing on that very first bottom screw that I'm drilling in here allowed me to make sure, hey, the top screw is going to be correct, so we're going to go ahead and mount in the top screw, and then just fasten everything else down and make that edge as clean as we can make it. Different species of woods have different characteristics. So a positive characteristic of cedar is that it's naturally rot resistant. We already talked about that earlier, but a negative characteristic of cedar is that the planks, whenever they dry, can cup or warp. It was pretty common for me to find a few planks here and there that just had a slight warp, and all I would do to mitigate that is just find the 2 straightest edges, put them together, and then fasten those pieces together to form an end panel. Now, that didn't quite work on this top piece here, which was warped. So the way I fixed that was just do what I did before. Focus on that bottom piece, make sure that it's square to that interior post as I screw it in, and then just apply some light downward pressure before using that hammer drill to screw in that final top plank. Now you're going to get a chance to see those miters that I made. So you'll notice there are some pre-existing holes on these pieces because, like I mentioned before, I'm just using wood from a previous project. So on that miter, you'll notice it's not just a true 45. They don't actually match up perfectly, which is by design. I actually kind of like this weird little edge here. So this is how I bookended them together. Now all I did was I just took a little 18 gauge brad nailer. I think if I remember right, the brad nails that I used were about 1.5 inches long, just small enough to hold the piece together, because in just a minute I'll actually attach these to the box and you'll see how I do that. But I just tack these on, just a few nails. I think I used 3 in most of these, but you can use as many or as few as you want to. After assembling both planter boxes on the back patio, I walked them off and put them along the right side of our fence in the backyard. Now, I roughly position them about 2 feet off of the fence just to give us enough room to pass through. And then you'll see in a moment here, I actually just opened up that back gate to make sure that we could still get through and go explore out the back. If you listen closely, you'll actually be able to hear my daughter singing, and this really just hit me in the middle of editing this video. I think it's really easy for me to get caught up in all these projects that I'm trying to do. There are things that I like to do. I want to be able to film them to show you guys, but oftentimes the most enjoyable part is just to get to be with my family. And it's really great to look back and to see how, you know, my little girl is growing up. My other little girl, she's growing up too, but sometimes it's important just to slow down, be with your family, take time to do that, and not be so focused on the project at hand. To attach those corner pieces to the planter box, I am using 3-inch decking screws. Now, I didn't just go ahead and grab the screw and then drill it straight into the cedar because that would actually cause it to split. It's pretty easy to split cedar. What I did do is either by hand or using a wood clamp like this, I held on that corner piece and then just marked a pilot hole and pre-drilled this pilot hole to allow me to fasten that screw in there. Just like I did with the other plank pieces, I used that larger drill bit to create a kind of a makeshift countersink, and then just drilled in those screws. So I would do 2 on either side of that interior post, and then 2 at the top, 2 at the bottom, and that just held that piece right on there, and I didn't have to worry about it coming off. And now just sit back, relax, and enjoy a very short montage of me screwing in all these corner pieces. It's kind of satisfying to watch, am I right? Now, I didn't want to leave this top area exposed, so I went ahead and measured a 4x4 square cap that would actually cover up all these individual pieces and just make it look a little bit prettier. Back to the table saw. So I set up the table saw just to be 4 inches wide and ripped down a piece of cedar 2x6 before then taking it over to my miter saw, just pre-marking. Now, really, I didn't have to use a tape measure. That's a little bit of overkill. You could have just used a 4-inch mark on a speed square, but after marking that up, I went ahead and just put the miter saw to it and cut out multiple end caps to be able to cover up those little edges. Now back to the backyard. So I brought out my air compressor and 16-inch brad nailer. I did use the longest brad nail that I had, which was 2.5 inches, to drive those top caps into the corners. And you can definitely see that there's a color discrepancy between that cap and the planks, but if you take a closer look between both planter boxes, there is a lot of color variation because certain pieces have patinaed and weathered more quickly than others because some have been outside a little bit longer. So this is really something where it's kind of up to you. You can pre-stain everything on the outside of the planters. I would recommend not doing the inside because you're going to expose the stain to the soil that's on the inside, unless, like me, you use a plastic barrier or plastic lining. But over time, all of the cedar will fade to that kind of gray, natural color. I personally like that. I may see how it goes here in the next few months and make a decision about whether or not I want to stain this, but either way, this cedar is going to do a wonderful job. Well, that's it. I'm pretty excited with the way this project turned out. It was a very simple design, pretty quick to put together, but even just looking at it right now, we don't have any vegetables in it yet. But I really love the way it breaks up the yard visually. The natural cedar against our pre-stained cedar fences really looks great. And again, I'm really looking forward to putting it to use this spring. But I want to know what you thought about the video today. What did you like? What did you not like? What do you think about the design? Just let me know your thoughts. Put them in the comments section below. If you've enjoyed this video today, please go ahead and check out one of our other videos. Other than that, really appreciate your time today. Hope you have a great rest of your day. See you guys.